Alrighty, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the December meeting of the Gene Winter Northeast chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. I'm Victor Mastone. I'm the chapter chair and the president of the Mass Archaeological Society. This will be our last meeting for calendar year 2023. Few announcements for those of you that are chapter members or think you're chapter members and you haven't paid your dues. Please send in your $6 to Dick Miller. We would greatly appreciate that because we use that to pay for speaker memberships to MAS and speaker dinners. On top of that, if you're not a member of the Mass Archaeological Society, I really encourage you to join. That will get you the bulletin and free admission to the museum, which has been changing. We're upgrading a lot of our exhibits. So if you haven't been to the Robinson Museum in a while, it'll be worth it. So I encourage you to join the society. On top of that, I encourage you to join the Danvers Historical Society, who's serving as our hosts, gracious hosts here at Tapley Hall. So it's a good meeting venue. So, and they do a lot of good research as well as community programming. So it's another worthwhile cause. And finally, on this side of the announcements, MAS is doing its annual appeal. We're seeking funds this year to help underwrite the cost of improving the environment in the building. That is to basically finally get some kind of HVAC system in there. And it's certainly beyond our normal means. So any donations would be greatly appreciated. Now, before we go on to tonight's speaker, I just want to let you know that our next meeting after tonight will be January 16th, 2024. Our speaker will be Joel Dukes of the National Park Service. I don't have his topic written down, but I'm sure it'll be an interesting topic. Now, tonight I have the pleasure to introduce Joel Hamill. He is a third-year graduate student in the Historic Archaeology program at UMass Boston. Several of us are alums of that program, and we are very pleased to have someone from there here. He did his undergrad. He's from Charleston, South Carolina, a lovely city, and I've been there many times. For business purposes as an underwater archaeologist. He worked for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and Heritage Trust Program, where he developed his interest in archaeology, and with that interest decided to pursue a graduate degree up here at UMass Boston. His research interests are informed by his work in South Carolina, and while attending UMass, he's also doing research on the history of the African diaspora. Oh, sorry, tonight I can't seem to be having, I'm having audio problems myself. There must be a disconnect up here, so some synapses isn't working. Heritage, landscape, architecture, and craft production. So it's a pretty wide variety of interests. Tonight he's going to talk about investigating the multiple uses and meanings of the Tabby plantation architecture. It's the type of material that they use to build the structures in South Carolina and in Beaufort County. So is it a specific plantation or are you going to? Okay. Okay, well, without any further interruption, I will go on and let Joel speak. Thank you, Joel.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for having me here tonight, everyone, and thanks for everyone who's joining in over Zoom. Yeah, as Vic introduced me, I'm a student from Boston. I'm going to talk about my research for my master's thesis, which is the thin section analysis of tabby from a plantation quarter in South Carolina. Now, this being the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, I'm sure most people here are unfamiliar with tabby and tabby architecture. But I hope, like in this conversation, that you'll kind of understand the importance tabby has in plantation landscapes in the South, in South Carolina, and Georgia, and Florida, but also how this type of analysis is helpful for lime mortar, lime plaster writ large, which is a pretty universal material and is all over the place. Basically, tabby is there we go. Tabby is a concrete-like building material made from lime, sand, oyster shells, and water that was used in the islands of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Sea Islands roughly extend from Charleston down to Jacksonville, Florida, and the region is historically known for its isolation and for its overwhelming Black majority. The Sea Islands are also home to the Gullah Geechee, which is a distinctive Creole identity that emerged among African Americans that reflects a diverse mixture of African cultural traditions, craft skills, languages, and foodways. Now, chemically and compositionally, tabby is a kind of lime mortar. However, instead of being used to bind together bricks and stones, how we typically think of lime mortar, tabby was often poured into wooden formworks and then allowed to set, creating thick, solid walls of tabby in the process, kind of akin to rammed earth. So these walls you see here, these are like solid tabby walls all the way through. The material was used to construct all kinds of buildings in the Sea Islands, such as forts, churches, civic buildings, plantation houses, outbuildings, as well as quarters for enslaved families. As you can see here on the right, it's a pretty famous example from Kingsley Plantation down in Florida. Now, as I was going to introduce, I'm from South Carolina. I got my start doing archaeology down there. But going into this research, I didn't know a whole lot about thin section analysis. Now, thin section analysis of tabby fragments can provide information about the origins of the raw materials used to make the material, as well as the manufacturing process. When you combine that with documentary evidence, this analysis provides insight into the knowledge and craft skills of enslaved African descendant people, what they brought to tabby architecture. And when contextualized with larger historical changes in plantation architecture and management in the Southern United States, this research is intended to highlight how plantation landscapes were created through a process of contestation and negotiation between the enslaver and enslaved community, as well as how that process became masked, particularly in the built environment. But anyways, so my research is on a site called Fort Frederick, which is a 3-acre property located in Beaufort County, South Carolina. It's about 3 miles downriver from the town of Beaufort, which is the second oldest permanent settlement in South Carolina after Charleston. This heritage preserve protects the remains of Fort Frederick, an 18th century tabby fort, and actually the oldest surviving tabby structure in South Carolina. Constructed between 1732 and 1735, Fort Frederick was commissioned by the British colonial government to protect the town of Beaufort from incursions by the Spanish in St. Augustine. With solid tabby walls measuring approximately 5 feet high and 5 feet thick, and overall dimensions of roughly 130 feet by 128 feet, Fort Frederick was meant to convey the power and the presence of British colonial authority. Fort Frederick, however, was not a very successful fort, and its use as such was short-lived. Described as being in a ruinous condition by 1752, construction of another tabby fort began upriver in 1757, and by the 1760s, Fort Frederick was abandoned. The reason why Fort Frederick fell into ruin so quickly is not really understood. Architectural historian and tabby expert Colin Brooker notes that the fort's remains suggest the tabby walls actually separated along core lines due to either faulty casting, contamination of tabby mixes, improper curing, or the walls actually shattering from the stress induced by the firing of the fort's cannons, all of which speak to the ways tabby architecture can fail mechanically. Now, from archival research I did over the summer, the land that contained the ruins of Fort Frederick was acquired by Captain John Joyner in 1764. So there wasn't this period of abandonment between the fort and it becoming a plantation. It was pretty seamless. But basically, these lands became part of a 700-acre plantation aptly named Old Fort Plantation. Now, very few records exist pertaining to Old Fort Plantation's colonial occupation. However, it seems that John Joyner was a successful planter engaged in the production of indigo. Supported by a royal bounty, indigo thrived in the sandy soil of the Sea Islands and existed as an alternative cash crop to rice. And like many men in his social standing, Joyner led a successful military and political life. During the American Revolution, he was named a commissioner to repair Fort Littleton, that other tabby fort, and he was appointed captain of the South Carolina Navy. Additional historical data points to Joyner leading a public life both before and after the Revolution by being involved in public building projects, overseeing the selling of public lands at auction, and serving as a representative in the South Carolina General Assembly. Unfortunately, because of the lack of historical documents pertaining to the site, almost nothing is known about Old Fort Plantation's enslaved community, especially during the tenure of John Joyner. The 1790 federal census lists 50 enslaved individuals residing at Old Fort Plantation, which matches the number of enslaved individuals listed by Joyner in his 1795 will. The 1790s were likely a time of immense change for the enslaved community at Old Fort. John Joyner died in 1796, leaving his 5-year-old grandson, John Joyner Smith, as heir to Old Fort Plantation. And Joyner's will specifies that his grandson was to inherit the plantation upon turning 21, with Anne Joyner, John Joyner's wife, John Joyner Smith's grandmother, holding possession of the plantation and the enslaved community until her grandson became of age. From the historical record, it seems that Anne Joyner was a woman of considerable influence. She was related to the Whigs, which is a pretty prominent family of planters in the Beaufort area. And while she may not have directed the day-to-day functioning of Old Fort Plantation, she did acquire additional properties that were later inherited by John Joyner Smith and was directly involved in her grandson's upbringing. The size and status of the enslaved community in 1800 is unknown. However, the 1810 federal census does list Joyner's estate with 100 enslaved individuals, and the growth of the enslaved population at Old Fort Plantation from 1790 to 1810 and the addition of properties by Anne Joyner all suggest that Old Fort Plantation was stable and profitable during this period. And this is actually the only known map of the plantation itself that dates to the 1860s. And as you can see, not a lot of information going about what this plantation looked like. It was also during the 1790s that Old Fort Plantation likely shifted from indigo to sea island cotton production. And after the American Revolution, the British bounty on indigo was repealed, which effectively ended indigo being a viable cash crop. Sea island planters began searching for another staple crop to fill the economic void, and cotton was first introduced to Georgia by way of the Bahamas in 1785, and by 1789, it kind of spread throughout Georgia, and by 1790, it took root in South Carolina. With the first commercial crop being cultivated, and throughout the 1790s, more and more sea island planters were taking up cotton cultivation. Now, encouraged by high returns from the English textile industry, plantation operations expanded, slave holdings increased, and cotton rapidly spread throughout the region. And actually became the single most important cash crop in the Sea Islands from the 1790s all the way up to the Civil War. This is actually a photo from Old Fort Plantation taken during the Union occupation and showing enslaved people at that plantation picking cotton in preparation for market. And actually, the strand of cotton that was grown in the Sea Islands was different than the green seed short staple variety that was grown in Piedmont and elsewhere in South Carolina and in the American South. This cotton was a black seed, long staple variety that commanded the highest market prices. And the development of sea island cotton brought immense wealth to the area and fueled an aristocratic way of life for planters that modeled itself on the exclusiveness and the refinement of English aristocracy. So when Smith, John Joyner Smith, reached the age of 21 in 1811, he inherited a successful sea island plantation in the form of Old Fort Plantation, as well as other lands from his mother and father's sides of the family. Profits from sea island cotton also fueled the expansion of the enslaved population. Between 1795 and 1808, when the legal slave trade ended in the United States, approximately 60,000 enslaved Africans were brought to South Carolina. Federal census records demonstrate that in the Beaufort district, there is a concentration of tabby architecture. The enslaved population grew from 14,600 to 27,300 in 1820. Comparatively, the white population only increased from 4,300 to 4,600 in the same period. So there's an overwhelming Black majority in Beaufort in this area, starting in the 1790s and on to into the Civil War. So it is during this period that the Tabby Plantation quarter I'm investigating for my master's thesis was occupied based on the ceramic assemblage remains in and around the remains of the structure, which implies a maximum occupation span of 1775 to 1825. The feature was first identified archaeologically in 2014-2015 by the South Carolina Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology, and later excavated by the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources Heritage Trust Program in 2019-2020 prior to construction of a public access road. Now, during the course of the project, the footprint of a 2-room, approximately 16 by 32-foot structure was almost entirely exposed, and massive amounts of dissociated tabby fragments were recovered. Many of these fragments contain a smooth, flat surface on one side and wood impressions on the opposite side. From the Tabby assemblage, if you will, I pulled 115 fragments from 16 2x2 meter excavation units that contain the footprint of the structure. And these samples were analyzed in terms of their composition and morphology to understand consistency or variation within Tabby production. Of specific interest was what any patterning in the Tabby assemblage could tell me about how the structure was built. And so from the initial analysis, 128 samples, or 86%, were described as being lath flat, meaning that the fragment contains both a smooth finish or exterior surface and an interior surface consisting of wood impressions. By exterior and interior surface, I mean the interior and exterior of the wall, not the structure itself. So 10 fragments only exhibit an interior surface, 8 fragments only exhibit an exterior surface, and 2 fragments were denoted as shaped. These fragments seem to have an intentional shape morphology, but do not feature clear structural impressions or a clear exterior surface. And so the number of structural impressions on each fragment was also recorded, with 73% containing 3 or more different structural impressions. And 8% of the samples, 6 different structural impressions were recorded. And finally, I categorized the samples based on the method of construction each fragment applied. So this is based on the angling of the impressions, with adjacent offset horizontal running impressions forming an uneven woven surface, kind of like a basket. 64 fragments, or 43%, were typed as wattles, meaning that they contain these impressions that reflected intersecting horizontal running impressions. 22% were typed as wattles with single posts, meaning that they displayed the woven horizontal impressions, but also had a perpendicular running impression, likely a post around which these wattles were woven. Now, 8% were typed as wattles with double posts, which displayed 2 perpendicular impressions. And notably, these impressions, these vertical impressions, were immediately adjacent to each other. And I believe that the outermost post in these samples probably comes from a larger support post adjacent to kind of these upright stakes around which the wattles were woven. So basically for a variety of reasons, it seems that the Tabby quarter at Old Fort Plantation is a wattle and tabby daub structure, and this is noteworthy for several reasons. It distinguishes the structure from cast or pour tabby structures like Fort Frederick, where the tabby was again poured into these formworks and compacted and allowed to set. With this structure, the wattle and tabby daub structure, a wooden frame consisting of flexible square wattles woven between upright stakes, interspersed between these load-bearing posts, was first erected, and then the tabby was worked into the frame, filling gaps and forming a solid wall until the wall reached the desired thickness and was then smoothed to form a flat exterior surface. The difference between construction technique is reflected in the material's composition, with cast tabby characteristically containing whole oyster shell and less binder compared to the tabby daub, which contains more binder and small crushed particles of oyster shell acting as a coarse aggregate. Additionally, it is clear from the analysis of the structural impressions that the tabby fragments, despite appearing as plaster at first glance, was not applied to brickwork or to an internal wall as slab and plaster. So you can see here an example of how these walls were intersected around posts. And for comparison, on the left here is a small sample of tabby from Fort Frederick, and on the right is another tabby daub fragment. You can see the clear kind of composition differences between those two materials. So wattle and tabby daub has a long but poorly understood history in the Sea Islands. This seemingly utilitarian style of tabby architecture quickly disintegrates when neglected or abandoned, leaving few traces of these buildings archaeologically. Most studies of tabby quarters or enslaved communities focus solely on extant structures. In terms of tabby architecture, extant structures are exclusively represented by cast tabby. While these buildings do degrade, they are massive masonry structures, so they tend to survive a lot better. They don't really go anywhere. On the right here is a photo of the B.B. Sam's tabby complex, where not only quarters for enslaved were made out of tabby, but also a dairy, other outbuildings, as well as the planter's house itself. And these ruins are from the planter's house. These buildings aren't going anywhere, even if they are in a ruined state. But Yeah, so extant plantation quarters represent the most durable and frequently the latest structures constructed during the plantation's lifetime, obscuring the breadth of plantation quarters and landscapes, and also the experiences of enslaved people therein. Now, in architectural terms, such buildings emphasize a high investment in manufacturing costs over maintenance costs, a trade-off that is reflective of elite individuals and institutions who have the capital to make an upfront investment in buildings production. To make something like this is incredibly expensive. Therefore, standing plantation quarters generally represent the highest level of investment and control by planters in the design and construction process, while more ephemeral forms of architecture, which emphasize a higher investment in maintenance over manufacturing, likely represent a higher degree of control over the design and construction process by the enslaved community. So Tabby's popularity as a building material is on one hand directly tied to how cheap and available the raw materials required for its production were compared to other incombustible building materials like brick. However, Tabby production and construction was a labor-intensive process, and its affordability was dependent on the availability of a large enslaved workforce. So fueled by the Seattle and cotton economy and the rising enslaved population, Tabby facilitated the construction of countless domestic, agricultural, and industrial structures in the Sea Islands between 1790 and 1820. Tabby construction on plantation sites specifically increases dramatically from 1790 to 1800, becoming the primary context for Tabby architecture from 1800 onwards. It is during this period too that the ideology of Tabby architecture is the most articulate. And so here's a picture at the bottom of these kind of wooden formworks. They would have been adjusted, they would have been cut as well to the size of the wall. And by them being adjustable, they could taper the wall as the walls gained in height. And here's, so years ago, Michael Sheehan, who's an archaeologist and one of the staffs, an architectural conservator, did kind of a survey of Tabby buildings, when they were built, and what they were for, and that's where this data comes from. That's how they're showing that after 1800, the use of Tabby on plantation sites just explodes. So the ideological component of Tabby architecture. After the American Revolution, Seattle planters positioned themselves as stern but fair patriarchs. They had this idea that they were these benevolent overseers who demanded deference and loyalty. And this paternalism at a distance ethos was a way for planters to counter rising abolitionist sentiment. With the end of the legal transatlantic slave trade, planters needed to present slavery as this kind of humane institution that benefited the enslaved as much as the slave owner. A pro-slavery reform movement focused on improving the living conditions of the enslaved population emerged among planters in the early 19th century. And this movement was popularized through agricultural journals and societies and resulted in widespread changes to the design and organization of plantation quarters, as well as the entire plantation landscape. Slave owners saw themselves as responsible for caring for and enlightening, quote, their people, and for providing a clean, orderly environment through which the slave owners believed obedient enslaved families would prosper and multiply. Plantation architecture, planter paternalism, and racial ideology are innately entwined characteristics of plantation culture that work to legitimize the status and the authority of the planter class in the wake of increasing scrutiny in the 19th century. And so antebellum cast Tabby quarters are closely connected with pro-slavery plantation reform. For wealthy planters, Tabby offered an affordable means to house enslaved people in neat linear villages that affirmed their racialized worldview of order and gentility. This is evident in the writings of Thomas Spalding, who's a Sea Island cotton planter in Sackville Island, Georgia. Writing the Southern Agriculturalist, a journal magazine published in Charleston in 1830, Spalding links Tabby explicitly with plantation reform and effective plantation management. He kind of extols the virtues of Tabby as a building material and emphasizes the necessity of permanent architecture in creating this unified, harmonious plantation landscape for the planter. Also, Sea Island planters downplayed the labor and skills required for Tabby's production for self-promotional purposes. In fact, in his Southern Agriculturalist article, Thomas Spalding describes even the most arduous and time-consuming tasks involved in the creation of tabby, such as the gathering of shells, the sand, burning and mixing the lime, to be done by enslaved workers during their free time. However, as many architectural conservators tasked with repairing historic tabby structures will attest to, there were many ways in which tabby can and did go wrong. A variety of factors, from sourcing the raw materials to the manufacturing process, could impact the final product. And the success of tabby architecture speaks directly to the workforce's familiarity with the material. Ultimately, how African descendant people, the primary makers and builders of tabby, view this material and what knowledge and skills they brought to tabby architecture is still largely unknown. And so the few historical records that mention wattle and tabby daub, along with a growing body of archaeological evidence, seem to suggest that wattle and tabby daub dwellings in the 18th and 19th centuries were created and occupied by enslaved Africans and African Americans with a considerable degree of autonomy over their living space. Archaeological excavations on Kalawasi Island in South Carolina uncovered the remains of a wattle and tabby daub structure built around 1817 by an enslaved worker at the Kalawasi Sugar Mill. Archaeological features and fragments of tabby daub indicate the structure was approximately 10 feet by 10 feet square, with 4-inch thick walls of woven wattles fixed to upright timber posts that were daubed inside and out. And actually, recently spoke to someone who worked on that site, and they confirmed that the impressions that we see at Old Fort Plantation are identical to the impressions in the tabby daub from this site. Wattle and tabby daub is also found on Sapelo Island in Georgia, and many of the tabby quarters found on these plantations are cast tabby. However, there are these out-of-sight settlements where wattle and tabby daub is found instead. And archaeologists working on Sapelo Island, they've interpreted these structures as evidence of creolization, and they also interpreted these structures as representing rival landscapes between spaces controlled by the planter and spaces controlled by the enslaved community. The wattle and tabby daub dwellings found in these out-of-sight settlements embody a set of negotiations made by enslaved people between these two landscapes, conflicting with the ideals and demands projected by slaveholders onto the same landscape. So because plantation quarters were a part of these two overlapping landscapes, that of the planter and that of the enslaved community, the design of plantation quarters may have been acceptable to both parties. Tabby plantation quarters must be read with these dual landscapes and meanings in mind. By investigating how this tabby daub structure was made, we can better understand the labor and skills that went into constructing these rival landscapes. And so, thin section analysis enables the observation of the mortar or plaster's texture and composition, from which information about manufacturing and construction can be obtained. Now, thin sections, if you don't know, are very thin cross sections mounted to a glass slide. The sample is reduced to a thickness of 20 to 30 microns, which enables light to pass through the material in the identification and analysis of the material's components in situ. So 35 tabby samples were selected as an ideal subsample for petrographic analysis. 20 of these samples were encapsulated with polyester resin under a vacuum, and when possible, an unaltered portion of these samples was preserved for future analysis. Following removal from the vacuum, the samples were placed in the fume hood, allowed to cure for 5 days, after which they were placed in a drying oven and baked for 24 hours. After the samples were removed from the oven, they were sectioned using the water-cooled dining saw, as you can see here on the right, in preparation for thin sectioning. These cross-sections were then scanned using a flatbed scanner as a means of photographing and documenting the cross-sections before further alteration. And from these observations made of the cross-sections, 14 samples were selected for thin section. In this photo on the left here, you can see a tabby fragment at different stages of the thin section process. So the large chunk at the bottom, that's resin impregnated sample, so that can be used for further analysis. And then on the left here, you can see a tabby cross section that was then cut down more to size to fit onto a glass side thin section. And so here's what the thin sections look like. And full characterization of these thin sections is still forthcoming. However, there are some interesting preliminary observations. Thin section analysis of mortars and plasters characterizes them in terms of three main components: the aggregate, the binder, and the voids or pores, which are empty spaces within the material. Each of these components plays an important role in the success of Tabby, and information about these components seen in thin section can be related to specific steps in the Tabby production process. So in Tabby, lime serves as the binder, which holds the aggregates particles together to a coherent mass. Now, due to limestone deposits in the Sea Island being deeply buried beneath layers of sand and silt, the most accessible source of lime came from oyster shells. Both naturally occurring oyster shells as well as oyster shells from indigenous shell middens. Therefore, the lime Tabby is exclusively derived from the burning of oyster shells. And we can see this in thin section with underburned shell fragments, which also speaks to the inconsistencies in temperature during the lime burning process. Some planters prefer to reference for dead oyster shells over live oyster shells due to dead oyster shells being easier to collect and transport and that they contain less salt. Many advocates of Tabby architecture emphasize the necessity of salt-free materials, believing the presence of salt resulted in a weaker material. Burning unclean live oyster shells also produce undesirable noxious fumes. So whether sourced from live oyster beds or ancient shell middens, it seems it was desirable to clean the shells of salt and organic material before the shells were burned. Now, we can't see salt directly in thin sections, but a lot of shell fragments and sand grains do contain clay coatings depending on the sample, and that could indicate these materials came from a marine environment and were not well cleaned before being burned and then added to the mix. So the burning or calcining of oyster shells in a kiln or on a lime brick sets into motion a process called the lime cycle. Oyster shell is primarily composed of calcium carbonate, and when subjected to intense heat, carbon dioxide is driven off, leaving behind calcium oxide or quicklime. To effectively reduce oyster shells into quicklime, a temperature of 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius has to be sustained. And to burn under basically results in underburned fragments. It doesn't make for a good mix. To overburn lime basically results in dead burnt lime. That also is not these two structural issues. So, and lime burning also requires a lot of shell and a lot of fuels. And so an excessive presence of charcoal can indicate the use of a lime rig for burning instead of a lime kiln, which would filter out the charcoal and would also result in a more consistent burning process. And also cross sections of charcoal within the thin section can be used to identify what wood they were burning for fuel. Now, quicklime is not chemically stable and it will react with carbon dioxide in the air, quickly becoming inert and unfit for making mortar and plaster. So once produced, quicklime needs to be stored in airtight barrels for later use or immediately slaked with water to slow the material from returning back to carbon dioxide, or calcium carbonate, excuse me. So when water is added to quicklime, an action referred to as slaking, a chemical reaction occurs, producing heat and steam. Depending on the amount of water, quicklime is either transformed into a powdered form or into a lime putty, both of which are calcium hydroxide. How exactly slaking was accomplished in Tabby making is not known and likely varied depending on the workforce and project demands. Lime putty was traditionally left to cure in pits or barrels for weeks, months, or years at a time before being mixed with aggregate and used in construction. But Tabby may have been produced using what's called a hot mix method, where sand was mixed directly into quicklime and the resulting steam was enough to adequately slake the lime. And so the presence of lime lumps featured here on the right, the big round kind of mass. Basically, the presence of these particles in the Tabby daub thin section suggests the use of hot mix instead of lime putty, which implies the mix was applied to the frame really quickly after burning the shell into quicklime. So this is something that is very ad hoc. It was not kept for long periods of time, or not stored. And so mechanical differences between mortars using lime putty and mortars using hot mix are not well understood, although the benefits of hot mixing are largely related to faster production and application at the cost of better control over mixing proportions and uniformity. And some material scientists report that hot mixing can result in a stronger lime mix. So after slaking and stirring, sieving was done to remove lumps and unslaked lime and to even incorporate the aggregate for further consistency and texture. Stirring and sifting also drives air into the mix, resulting in bubbles or pores that makes the material more durable and protects against freeze thaw damage. And so porosity, which can be overlooked, these empty spaces are incredibly important because on one hand, you need those empty spaces for the material to gain strength, but too many pores results in a deep mixture. So it's an incredibly delicate balance of finding the right proportion of material or of porosity and the ratio of pores to binder to the aggregate. So sand along with crushed oyster shells are added to lime as aggregate, which offsets the shrinking and cracking of the lime as it dries, which provides strength, workability, and durability in the material. Now, sand and oyster shell are both inert aggregates, which mean that they do not chemically react with the lime binder. And the sand aggregate is overwhelmingly quartz and has a subangular subgranite morphologies, which suggests that that sand came from a river in origin, which is not too surprising considering Old Fort Plantation is directly along the Beaufort River, but it does contradict historical recommendations for pit sand and a preference for salt-free materials in tabby production. There are also lime inclusions within the sand aggregate, which is basically reused lime tabby mortar, which points to them kind of grinding up old tabby fragments and adding them to the mix akin to grog and ceramics. And so additives and admixtures are added to tabby or added to mortars in small quantities to provide strength and waterproofing and durability. We don't really see these materials in tabby, although that's something that I'm kind of investigating with the tabby daub. There are clay fragments within it. And again, that addition of clay coatings on some sand particles and some shell particles could have an effect and basically allow the tabby to gain strength in different ways. But few factors affected the final quality of tabby more than choice of mix. Now, Thomas Spalding, who I've mentioned a few times before, he published a recipe involving equal proportions of lime, sand, oyster shell, and water. However, when people went to recreate that recipe, they found that his recommendation for water was too much, and it actually led to poor quality tabby. So tabby mixes from Beaufort, it's been observed that consistently contain more shell, with one recipe calling for 1 part lime, 2 parts sand, and 4 to 6 parts shell. However, from the historical record, it seems there was not a hard and fast rule to tabby making, and that really depended on kind of the feel of the workforce and how they felt about the quality of the lime. They would adjust the ratio of the materials accordingly. And so once the materials were mixed, there's proportions. The workers had a few hours to apply the mix before beginning to stiffen and losing its plasticity. And as the mortar dries out, the hydrated lime crystallizes and binds the mix together into a process called setting. And from continued exposure to the air, the calcium hydroxide reacts with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, reverting back to calcium carbonate, which is referred to as hardening or carbonation. The material hardens at the surface first, and it continues to harden and gain strength through the penetration of carbon dioxide into those pores. And because, depending on its porosity, lime mortar can take months or years to attain its ultimate strength. What's interesting is that in a lot of these examples, the lime binder is quite heterogeneous, with samples displaying what I describe as a mottle texture. These binders appear to have identical aggregates, so they are the same material, but under the microscope, the lighter areas appear more amorphous or micritic, while the darker areas appear more crystalline or microsporidic for you geology folks, indicating different geochemical reactions as the binder sets and undergoes carbonation. This could be because of different sources of lime being burned together or inconsistencies in the lime burning process. It could be evidence too of, when I was talking about those additives, things that kind of change the chemical composition of the lime and giving it different properties. It could be evidence of that happening, but not throughout the entire material. So if someone out there knows what this could mean, please reach out to me. I'd love to know, because I have not found a conclusive answer. And basically, after the walls were created and allowed to set and harden, the tabby had to be protected by a layer of stucco. While permeability was necessary for tabby to harden and gain strength through exposure to air, it also allowed water from rain, humidity, and rising damp to seep into the pores and accelerate these processes of erosion. So to minimize the threat, tabby structures were often coated in 2 or more layers of tabby plaster made from oyster shell lime and fine sand. Interestingly enough, 5 samples contain 2 or more layers of tabby daub, with the first interiormost layer smooth to produce a flat surface onto which a second layer or coat was added. In some of these samples, the 2 layers appear to be compositionally the same, so not a finishing coat. But in one sample, there are clear differences. In the sample on the left here, the exterior layer contains less sand aggregate and has a pure lime binder, likely a stucco or a finishing coat to protect the interior fabric. In another sample, a very thin stucco or whitewash is observed with another layer of tabby daub kind of added on top, which maybe reflects the addition of more coats of tabby over time as maintenance, as something that I'm still trying to figure out. Here's that stucco layer. And this might be the whitewash that I just mentioned. And so this layer on the left here could be a refreshing finish, a refreshing coat. And this kind of these lighter areas here, these streaks are the kind of acrylic texture binder that I also mentioned. It's a little more obvious in some samples, but something that I want to point out is that under the microscope, this stucco layer does not appear the same as these acrylic texture areas. So even though like color may be similar, that doesn't necessarily mean that chemically or mineralogically that these are the same material, the same or the same processes are happening to these parts of the tabby daub. So by all accounts, John Joyner Smith, who inherited Old Fort Plantation, made well on his inheritance, and he was a highly successful planter until 1861, when the Union seized and occupied the plantation for the remainder of the Civil War. It seems John Joyner Smith was heavily invested in this pro-slavery plantation reform movement and cultivated an image of gentility that characterized the planter class in the Sea Islands during the antebellum period. Smith's interest in presenting slavery as a humane institution was manifested in Old Fort Plantation's landscape through the construction of a chapel and new quarters for the enslaved community. These quarters, pictured here on the left, built no earlier than the 1840s, are well documented in numerous photographs taken during the Civil War, and though they're not made of tabby, they epitomize the changes in plantation architecture brought about by the plantation reform movement. These quarters are uniformly timber-framed, wood-clapboard duplexes that are raised on brick piers, that have a shared chimney and a loft over the living space. And other photographs indicate that these quarters were laid out in a line, and according to one northern observer, were not far away in plain sight from the planter's house. Now, spatially and architecturally, these quarters enabled increased surveillance and discipline by mimicking the style of Smith's plantation residence, pictured here on the right, and being visible from the planter's domain. These quarters were a part of Smith's formal landscape and worked to reinforce the status of the planter in the enslaved power structure. By the Civil War, it seems tabby daub quarters were erased from the plantation's landscape, as there is no documentation of them in any photographs or accounts from Northern soldiers or teachers who were stationed at the plantation. Plantation landscapes are bracketed by the planter's house on one end and quarters for the enslaved on the other. These two structures were fundamentally linked by the racial ideologies and the power differential that upheld the plantation system. Furthermore, plantation landscapes were not static creations, but they were shaped throughout time in response to shifting ideologies and social relations, and in turn, they mediated the very ideologies and social relations they were produced by. Accounts and photographs of Old Fort Plantation by Northern observers in the Civil War are snapshots in time of a landscape that worked to present itself as natural and timeless, actively erasing previous incarnations where the threads of contestation and negotiation that constituted the plantation landscape were more visible. Tabby is clearly not a neutral material. It's not simply just a cheaper alternative to brick. It's not clearly a cheaper alternative to building with brick or stone. Tabby architecture carried profoundly different meanings to different groups of people occupying the same space. In this way, tabby is emblematic of the contradictions inherent in plantation landscapes and slavery itself. That although slaveholders severely circumscribed the lives of enslaved people, they never fully defined them. try as they might to present themselves as masters over their plantations and the rest of Southern society, this guise ultimately depended on concessions and cooperation with the enslaved population. Attention to the design and the construction process of plantation quarters, especially more ephemeral forms of architecture, such as wattle and tabby daub, can uncover these previous landscapes and social dynamics. Thank you.
If anyone who is watching online has any questions, you can put it in the chat and I will relay it. Everything. I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is not necessarily anything you're doing for your research, but sort of everyone who is doing sort of tabby related research. Are there, in terms of trying to find some of the information about how it was manufactured and everything, like doing like oral traditions or looking at some of the, you know, documents that aren't typically looked at to see if it may have been recorded or, you know, descendant communities?
Certainly. So that's something I didn't talk
involved?
about in my presentation because it's already as long.
Yes.
Sorry about that. But no, so tabby actually ceases to be made after the Civil War. It's because that large enslaved labor force that it was dependent upon, because that evaporated, people were no longer building in tabby, and if it lingered at all after the Civil War, the introduction of Portland cement kind of rendered it obsolete. And so that's, you know, readily available bags of cement are much easier to make a building out of than tabby, so it is a lost art. But what architects and historians who have studied tabby have noticed uniformly is that recipes published by planters on tabby, they're not accurate, or they kind of
Shocker, the person not doing
Exactly.
it doesn't know what they're writing about.
Or there's way more regional variety than those kind of recipes would make you think.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
At the beginning, you were saying that they moved from indigo production to cotton production. What is the indigo plant used for? Is it used like sort of dye?
That's exactly
Oh,
it.
okay.
Yes, it's a very complicated process, but they were essentially taking the indigo plant, reducing it into indigo cakes, and they were shipping that out to factories in England, as well as I'm sure to the Northeast as well.
So what blue can be made from?
Yeah, so blue jeans are dyed with synthetic indigo.
That's interesting. So they just switched the cotton because it was more profitable, probably more desired.
Yeah, indigo is so expensive to make that it required a royal bounty to be profitable, and then once that was gone, planters kind of turned to a different crop.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it always existed alongside rice as well. Rice was grown in different parts of coastal South Carolina and thrived in different soils. So indigo and rice were kind of together, but in separate kind of regional or I guess like geological areas. And sea island cotton kind of overtook those areas where indigo was grown.
You still have Carolina rice in storage?
Yeah.
Is it really still in the Carolinas?
That's a fascinating topic. So Carolina rice, along with sea island cotton, after the Civil War, those strains were kind of lost, and researchers and scientists have done a lot to bring those strains back. But the Carolina gold rice that you can buy in stores today is not the same strain of Carolina gold rice that existed before the Civil War.
I have another question, more for, and I don't know how much you may know about this, that you had shown the fort, the early on photo made from Tabby, and it was right on the water.
Yes.
How does climate change affect the preservation? While I know, as you say, something that big, you know, whether it's this or that plantation house, or if it's a large church, is always going to be there. But I didn't know if this is something, it's susceptible to the environment anyways, but if like climate change and flooding and all that is like even worse.
Right, yeah, so the Sea Islands as a region is extremely under threat from coastal erosion and sea level rise, and that area overlapping with what's called the Golo Geechee Heritage Corridor. It's these landscapes are very important to the Gullah Geechee and their identity. These areas are being threatened by sea level rise as well as development. A lot of Gullah Geechee people can no longer live due to rising real estate values. And so those two threats combined also threaten tabby architecture. These structures are located along the coast because tabby was dependent on availability of oyster shells. You don't see tabby that much inland. It's very restricted in this very narrow coastal area. And so heritage at risk is a big focus for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, not just with this site, but other sites along the coast. And yeah, that's something that people are reckoning with that, but mostly focused in terms of Gullah Geechee heritage. And there's not, I wouldn't say that tabby is necessarily explicitly linked with Gullah Geechee heritage, but it's definitely a body of knowledge that the Gullah Geechee, that their ancestors had. And that's something to be talked about as well.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a question in terms of the material.
Yeah.
See, you're talking about them using this tabby material as opposed to using brick. Whereas in the Northeast, if you had brick, it was also a sign of availability and prosperity.
Yes.
I mean, there's still a lot of wood down there, and I know that this is susceptible to insect predation, but is there a distance between brick production and places where tabby was used? Is it a nice spatial separation, or are they proximate to each other? And it's just a conscious choice.
Yeah, so tabby production that we see here with Fort Frederick and like other tabby plantation houses starts to wane around the 1830s, 1840s, because brick does become easily available. There's regular ferry service between the islands, the mainland, and other brick factories are starting to go into production in the area. So brick was also used in small quantities to kind of supplement tabby architecture. It was used in corners to kind of provide more mechanical support. Because the tabby walls were load bearing, sometimes in windowsills they would lay in brick as well. But plantation houses in this region made completely out of brick are very rare. And I think there's a case where a planter almost went bankrupt because he tried to build a plantation house out of brick before brick was readily available. So tabby was kind of planters went to great expense for their houses to conceal that it wasn't made of tabby. They would stucco it and in some cases carve the whitewash to look like granite stones from a distance. So it was a lot of smoke and mirrors, and they would never like leave tabby walls exposed on the inside. These were always like well decorated with like wooden walls with paneling and so on. So it was, don't look at the man behind the curtain, don't look, to what these walls are actually made out of. So it was a lot of, these were wealthy individuals, but their wealth was limited and by the environmental circumstances. And so there was a lot of effort to present themselves as more affluent than they actually were. And also that those iconic scenes of like these giant plantation houses flanked by these idyllic looking quarters for the enslaved, that was only achieved by like 1% of the slaveholding class in the southern states. Very, very few planters reached that level of wealth, and they wanted to present that as a model of how much the rest of white southern society could aspire to, but no one could achieve.
So were there a lot of plantations, more than like individual independent little farmers?
No, most Southerners before the Civil War did not enslave people, and then most people who ran plantations, they were generally smaller, they were less than 30 or 20 enslaved individuals. But those giant plantations where there's 80, 100, 200 people who are enslaved, living in bondage on those sites were very, very few. Although in this region, because of selling cotton and how much wealth it generated, there was a disproportionate amount of plantations of that caliber in this region.
Another question related to Tabby, in terms of the construction technique you use, you talk about it's basically a wattle and Tabby construction with a wattle daub. And is that to give it structural strength so that, for example, you couldn't make Tabby bricks because they have no structural strength?
They actually did. They, that's another, so Tabby was truly used for everything you can imagine. They made Tabby bricks and would then bind those bricks together using mortar. They made Tabby ceilings, they made Tabby floors. In some cases, they made Tabby cisterns. Like the amount of, like, if they could use Tabby for it, they absolutely did. But wattle and Tabby daub, yeah, it's, you know, there are clearly from like just looking at all these fragments that there's a difference in the composition. Maybe it was easier to produce than say like this kind of Tabby where there's like tons and tons of oyster shells being compacted. So maybe it was easier to produce. And there's another argument to be made that the wooden wattle and the post framework kind of acted the way that modern rebar works in concrete, where it's the wooden elements kind of work with I don't want to say tensile strength, and the Tabby is good for compressive strength. So maybe these two elements, though they were easier to make, you know, complemented each other in ways that we just don't really understand. Yes.
Especially like an early form liner system and make make Tabby look like it had a stone veneer or brick veneer or something like that.
Yeah, there's a few historical accounts where, you know, again, these fabrics, such as this, the BB Sam's complex, that would have been covered in stucco, and then artisans would come in and carve it to look like stone from a distance, or in some cases painted as well. Sometimes dyes were added. That was rare. The thing is that because Tabby production didn't really continue after the Civil War, these buildings kind of, even like these planter estates fell into ruin, and those stuccos kind of fell off. They decayed, and so I think a lot of people, when they think of Tabby, they think of this image up here of like this exposed, like shelly surface. These buildings never would have looked like that back in the day.
Interesting. Any other questions? I will say this is making me want to go back and read the journals of Charlotte Fortin, who,
Yes.
for those who may not know, is the sort of North Shore connection to the Sea Islands. Is she went to Salem Normal School. She was the first African-American to graduate from Salem Normal School. She was an abolitionist from an abolitionist family in Philadelphia, but came up here for education. And after the Civil War, she went down and taught at the Sea Islands and kept these journals. She taught a newly emancipated individuals. So
Yeah, I believe she taught at the Penn Center, which is about 30 minutes drive from this site. So
okay.
These are all.
Now I want to go back and see if her journals mention anything, because it has a lot of wealth of information in there. So now I want to be like, she talk about buildings like architecture or something, right? Like comment on it. So that might be.
And to the point about, you know, Northern soldiers and teachers like on the plantation sites, and Old Fort in particular, there was a Northern teacher there who was running a school on the plantation. And there was also Union officers stationed in the plantation house, and then all of them remark about the weird shell fort right next to it, but they never say anything about Tabby daub quarters or Tabby quarters on the site. So clearly, by the 1860s, these structures were not these like wattle and Tabby daub structures were no longer visible on the landscape.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very informative to me. Just to remind folks that we'll be back again on January 16th, and hopefully you'll join us then. Thank you.